Good morning and welcome to another Bright News discussion. My name is Shannon Braswell, and today I have a very special guest. It's been a long time in the making. So I'm here with Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds. So, Dr. Reynolds, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. Yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks, Shannon. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to get this going for a while. So now we're here. So just for starters, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself and your work and all of that?
Yeah, sure. Be delighted to. I study Islam, the Quran's relationship with the Bible. I started that as an undergraduate, and I really became interested in learning the Arabic language. Many years ago, started traveling to the Middle East, went to Jordan, to Syria, then eventually to some other countries. I was really just as a lot of sort of Americans or Westerners who go over to the Islamic world, like you just see how public Islam is, so you hear the call to prayer through loudspeakers, you see people in religious dress, everyone wants to speak about religion. So that just, was really kind of an inspiration for me to learn more about Islam, understand it from an academic point of view. And yeah, went on to do a graduate degree and have been teaching at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Theology for about 20 years now.
Wow, wow, that's great. Now, you, as I understand, and I've listened to a couple of your talks. You run a podcast that deals with Islam on at Notre Dame, and uh,
Exactly.
it's on YouTube, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah,
podcast is exploring the Quran and the Bible. So
yeah,
lots of chats with academics, some of it, pretty nerdy and technical, but other episodes are more sort of like about the big issues that lots of people will find interesting.
mhm.
Where does the Quran come from? How is it passed down to subsequent generations? How is it related to the Bible? All that sort of stuff.
Right. Okay. Well, now if we can get into the meat of the discussion,
Okay.
you know, I wanna start out by asking the question of can we start with the conflict like in in late antiquity, the
Right.
conflict between the Romans and the Persians before the rise of Islam. So I guess what was going on between these two powerhouses uh, before the rise of Islam?
Yeah, great. It's a really important to set the emergence of Islam and its historical context. And like that is the key question, Shannon, is how the dynamic of the conflict between these, as you said, these major empires in, the Byzantine Empire, which is the descendant basically of the ancient Roman Empire, and then further to the east, the Persian or Sassanian Empire. I mean, very often, like I would say, the standard model for the rise of Islam is it was this conflict that more or less provided an opening for like a third party, for a new kid on the block to enter into the scene, right? That basically like Rome and Persia basically fought each other into a stalemate and exhausted themselves in the process, So there's this idea that neither Rome nor Persia was sort of equipped to respond to the Arabian conquest. Another interesting dimension of this conflict between Rome and Sasanian Persia. So we're speaking about, I mean, the traditional date for the rise of Islam. Muhammad begins preaching in 610, dies in 632, and really right after that, I mean, the first successor, his name is Abu Bakr. He reigns for 2 years, dies in 634. But at the end of his reign, or at the beginning of the following caliph or successor, the Islamic conquests really get going outside of Arabia, attacking the Romans, attacking the Persians. But an interesting dimension to the conflict between Rome and Persia is there seems to be a religious dimension to it, which may sort of be a key to understanding what's going on with Islam, right? Because as you know, I'm sure Byzantine Empire is Christian. I mean, Constantine in the early fourth century, he himself is baptized, but also, promulgates an edict that allows for freedom of worship. But very soon, by the end of the fourth century, Christianity is spreading and becoming the dominant religion, and eventually the empire. By the time we get, to someone like Justinian, this major emperor, closer to the period of Islam's emergence, like the empire is thoroughly Christian. Meanwhile, in the East, the Sasanian Empire is Zoroastrian. So something we don't know or hear a lot about today, but there's a religious quality also to the Sasanian Empire. There's a major Christian minority in the East in the Sasanian Empire, which sort of complicates things. Because, how do you deal with a conflict with a Christian empire when you have a large Christian minority?
Mhm.
But that minority was from a different church,
Yes.
as you may know, what we call today the Church of the East. So that sort of helped them manage that situation. In any case, like the religious dimension to the conflict and sort of the integration or the marriage between sort of political ideology, military ambition, and religion. For a lot of people, like this sort of sets the scene and maybe directly informs the way early Muslims were thinking in sort of the integration in early Islam between religious violence, conquest, and like this the spiritual message of the religion.
Okay. Okay. So as far in terms of, and I'm going to try my best not to get off from the question, so I
Okay,
don't take up
okay,
too much of your time. But
okay.
uh, as far as Christianity in the East, you're talking about the Nestorians. Am I
Exactly,
correct?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as far as the way in which the I would say pre-Muslim
Mhm.
uh, pre-Muslim Arabs,
Yes.
you know,
Mhm.
and this is, I guess, a
Exactly.
question we'll get into later. But what would they have thought about the world that they were living in prior to the rise of Islam?
Yeah, it's a super question, a difficult one, because our knowledge of pre-Islamic Arabian religion, culture, like life, is really meager. I mean, a large part of it, at least the traditional ideas, kind of like the standard ideas, were built on what later Muslims writing in Arabic, but much later, like a couple of centuries later, like 8th,
Mhm.
ninth, 10th, not really even 8th, but ninth, 10th centuries, what they sort of projected backwards to
Okay.
the society. Muslim sources speak about pre-Islamic Arabia. There's an
Mhm.
Arabic term called Jahiliyyah, which means
Okay.
the age or the area of ignorance.
Mhm.
And they mean ignorance of divine revelation, basically. It's not a wholly negative picture that they paint of these pre-Islamic Arabs. But I
Right.
mean, that idea or standard ideas are beginning to be challenged by what we're finding through archaeology, but especially through inscriptions.
Okay.
There's so much to be said, Shannon. So if I talk too long, just interrupt me. Just be like,
No, no, it's
Reynolds,
it's
like,
fine.
take it
Yeah.
easy. There's a lot to be said. I mean, on the one hand, we know that there was a profound religious shift even before Islam.
Okay.
So we have tens of thousands of inscriptions dating from a few centuries BCE up to the early centuries of the Christian era that are what are called Safavidic inscriptions. This is in the northern parts of Arabia. So what is now like northern Saudi Arabia and Jordan, southern Syria, principally. These Safavidic inscriptions are pagan, polytheistic. So there's a whole like pantheon of pre-Islamic Arabian gods and goddesses.
Mhm.
They attest to certain rituals and things. So
Mhm.
this is really not my area, so I probably shouldn't say
Okay.
too much before I say something
No
stupid.
problem.
But
No
you may know Ahmed Jalad, the sort
problem.
of Ohio State University, sort of the great scholar of that.
Mhm.
But anyway, there's a really profound shift that takes place at the end of the 5th century CE or AD, where suddenly these excuse me, these Safavidic pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions that are polytheistic disappear,
Okay.
and we have a new set of inscriptions that suddenly appear, which are called Paleo-Arabic. And these are without except, first of all, the script is different. That's why they're called Paleo-Arabic, because they're in a
Okay.
version of what we know as the Arabic script. And then
Okay.
second of all, and most importantly, they're all monotheistic.
Okay.
So there was a move towards monotheism about 100 to 150 years before Muhammad begins to preach in
Mhm.
Mecca. Yeah, I mean, to me, that's like a really interesting point.
Mhm.
Probably the majority of these monotheists were Christians.
Okay.
It's a little bit hard to tell, but most of the inscriptions that have been found that are Paleo-Arabic, so the second stage of inscriptions, are either sort of vaguely, generally monotheistic, but those that can be determined further have all turned out to be Christian. So this is actually a really significant change in ideas about pre-Islamic Arabia. Increasingly, scholars think that Christianity had spread not only like on the margins of the Arabian Peninsula, so Palestine, Syria, etc., and then in the south, what is now Yemen. But now there's increasing evidence that Christianity had spread to the interior, probably to the area right around Mecca and Medina.
Okay, okay. That's I'm glad you brought that up because that I think that was or still might be a long-standing debate, and
Yeah.
there's still a few scholars that, especially I know in on the in Europe, who believe that there was no Christian presence in the interior, right? In
Exactly. So
Mecca.
the yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like this is contested.
Mhm.
So I'm on the other side of that argument. So
Okay.
so that showed through in my description. But you're absolutely right to point out this is contested. It's contested by actually two different sorts of scholars. So on the one hand, there's a scholar by the name of Aziz Al-Azmeh, who works in Europe, and he's written this really long, detailed book called The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity. And he holds that paganism still had survived. He speaks of Mecca and Medina as a pagan reservation.
Okay.
And he's like, this was like the last island of paganism that still was around in this period. And but yes, otherwise, he sort of defends the traditional story of Islam's emergence. And then you have scholars like Guillaume D, another European scholar, and in the US, Stephen Shoemaker. He's written a book called Creating the Quran. It's made a lot of waves.
Yes.
And those two, I mean, they agree with Aziz Al-Azmeh on the point that paganism was still around, but then they say, and this means that Islam probably could not have begun in this pagan context because there's so much monotheism in the Quran, so
Okay.
much biblical material in the Quran that it probably began further to the north.
Okay. 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 So with that, how would how would Arabs have seen themselves prior to the rise of Islam? I mean, uh, I guess maybe you can say they don't call themselves Arabs prior to the to not everyone that would consider themselves Arab today would have called themselves Arab,
Right, right,
prior to
right.
Islam. So uh, how would when does the shift in becoming, I guess, identifying yourself as
Yeah.
Arab
It's
take place?
also a difficult one.
Okay.
That's a
Okay.
difficult one. There's a lot of ink been spilled on
Okay.
this question, actually. I mean, sometimes academics they get into these questions that like you wouldn't think would generate so much controversy.
Right.
And yet, between academics they do.
Right.
So,
Right.
it's actually a big problem. There are references to Arabs in the Bible,
Mhm.
the reference to Ishmaelites in the Bible. So, and then there's references in very early inscriptions, and I won't be able to remember
Okay.
exactly when and where, but Robert Hoyland has a really good book on the history of the Arabs up to Islam. And
Okay.
I can't think of the title offhand, but if you look for Robert Hoyland, search Robert Hoyland Arabs before Islam, you'll find it.
Yes.
And he sort of charts all of these early references to Arabs in non-Arabic languages, principally. So, very early, like Akkadian
Mhm.
inscriptions and things seem to refer to Arabs. But it's just not sure, or it's not clear that these early references to Arabs refer to anything other than sort of nomads, like, tent dwelling, camel herding nomads. It seems to be the way, even the biblical references. Gosh, I think there's a reference in one of the prophets to this place will be punished such that not even an Arab would pitch his tent here because it'll
Mhm.
be so desolate.
Mhm.
The references to Arabs tend to refer to them in that way.
Mhm.
And the Quran doesn't really clear things up because the Quran refers to the Arabic language,
mhm,
So clearly there was an idea that there's this language called Arabi in Arabic, and the Quran is really, I mean, really insists that it's distinguished from other scriptures by its Arabic language. It refers to Bedouins with a word related to that. It calls them Arab. For example, in Surah
okay.
49, I think it's verse 13 is a famous verse. So Surah or chapter 49 of the Quran, verse 13. So yeah, but I mean, most scholars think that there's probably something like a contemporaneous formation of an Arab identity as a people with the rise of Islam and the notion of descendants from Abraham through Ishmael.
Okay.
These things are all related.
Mhm.
Um, so I could go on a little bit more about it. I don't want to bore your listeners too much,
Oh,
but I mean there are references right before Islam with some Christian historians who seem to refer to what we would identify as the Arabs, although they don't call them Arabs.
mhm,
For example, like there's a Byzantine historian by the name of Sozomen. Sozomen refers to the people who dwell on the other side of the Jordan River, so what is today the country called Jordan,
mhm,
and he speaks of them as Ishmaelites, and
mhm,
he seems to be doing that because of the narrative, and I think it's Genesis 21, you could correct me on that, where Abraham and Sarah expel Hagar and her son Ishmael into the wilderness. So there's
mhm,
this kind of idea that, oh, if they were expelled into the wilderness, then the wilderness people today must be their descendants. So these
mhm,
things seem to all go together, like the formation of a people. Some people use this term, a fancy term, ethnogenesis. So the
mhm.
formation of a people
Yeah.
with the rise of Islam, a scripture in the language of this people, etc.
Okay. 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 So we're getting it. We're getting a little handle on the on what's coming up. So okay. 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 Can you speak on the can you talk about the life of Muhammad according to the traditional view and then that of the, I guess what would be called the historical critical view?
Mhm, mhm.
Um, because these are, I suppose they're pretty different, right?
Yeah, and there's diversity within each of those sort of categories, Shannon, as you probably know. So, I mean, there's the historical or biographical literature in Islam, mostly written in Arabic, I mean, has all sorts of traditions. So the way these books are constructed is through these like individual discrete traditions. They're called
Mm,
akhbar in Arabic. It just is a word that just means reports. So we have
mm,
all these traditions of reports, one after another. And they give you sort of these little snapshots of, I don't know, like a story of something from Muhammad's childhood or something from his time in Mecca or his time in Medina. And it's pretty hard, even if you're only working with the Islamic sources, to put them all together into sort of one smooth biographical narrative. I mean, Muslims have done that, right? So later Muslims, writing in many languages, including in English, later Muslims have written these narratives where they try to, a little bit like in the Christian tradition, there's this idea of writing a harmony of the Gospels. And there have
mhm.
been some like evangelical projects, like I think the Jesus movie, and some of
Yes.
the other movies that are like just let's integrate the four Gospels. So, like a similar phenomenon took place already in the medieval period and some of the later biographies, and then in the modern period. But it's tough, yeah. And then there's lots of diversity in the historical critical side of things. So, but I
Right.
mean, in a very brief, sort of abridged version of the traditional life of the prophet, Muhammad comes from a very unique background because his family is, he's descended from Abraham through Ishmael. His family is connected to this shrine in Mecca called the Kaaba. His grandfather is a man named Abdul Muttalib, was sort
Mm,
of responsible for protecting and guarding the shrine. Um, and then he's born to parents who will both die early, His father, by some reports, dies before his birth. His mother dies when he's still very young. So he's an orphan who's then protected by his uncle, whose name is Abu Talib. Abu Talib, by the way, is the father of Ali, who's a really important person for Islamic history.
Right.
And the first 40 years of his life are not really emphasized in the reports. But usually, the biographers, the Muslim biographers, like to simply emphasize his sort of noble qualities. So a lot of complimentary language about, his honesty, his trustworthiness, people, also his sort of instinctual monotheism. So he avoided all of excuse me, the pagan activities that were going on in Mecca. And then during a moment where he's sort of in a state of meditation at the age of 40 in a cave outside of Mecca, God sort of calls him to prophethood, reveals the first 5 verses of the Quran, speaks to him through the angel Gabriel in the Arabic language. And then the subsequent part of his prophetic career is sort of divided between the Meccan period, where he's basically just a warner. He's just delivering God's message, but not seeking or using political power or violence. It has no legal role, has no political role. And then the second part of his career, when he moves to the city in the north that will become to be called Medina, where things change really profoundly. So, in addition to the sort of prophetic role he has in preaching God's word, he now has a political role, a military role, and a judicial role. So he's leading the community, he's leading the armies out in warfare against the infidels, but then he's also, adjudicating between disputes, establishing law, and then enforcing law as the statesman of the city.
Right.
And then he dies in 632 after sort of this triumphant campaign in which he overcomes the people of his own city who had opposed him, the Meccans. So,
Okay.
and then, I mean, the historical critical side of things, there's a lot that could be said about that.
Hmm.
I mean, going from an extreme of scholars who doubt whether Muhammad existed at all. Like this
Mm.
would be the most extreme view. There's a couple books out there which advance that thesis, but I mean, most scholars don't take this very seriously.
Right.
I mean, there's both the evidence of the Quran, but also non-Islamic evidence. So different sources, very early from the 630s, and his traditional death date is 632. So very early evidence attesting to the historical Muhammad. So he existed.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I guess now just with the traditional view, uh, is there a different view about Muhammad's life and particularly his death or the way he would have
Mhm.
died, according to Sunni tradition and the Shi'i tradition?
Mhm, mhm.
Um, I don't remember there's a different view according to the Sunni and the Shi'i tradition in
Yeah,
regards
yeah.
to the Prophet Muhammad's life and then particularly in the way he would have died. Um, and I'm thinking here, I can't remember which scholar said this, but you know, there's I guess a Shiite tradition that believes that the Prophet Muhammad would have been murdered or something like that. Is that
Yeah, so here's what I got on that account. I mean, really important. It is really important to note that you have, these two big families within the Islamic community, and they have really different views
okay?
of Muhammad, but especially of the companions,
Okay.
because that's like where the rubber meets the road in the
Mm-hmm.
split between Sunnis and Shias is the view of the companions of Muhammad. Because
Mm-hmm.
from a Shia perspective, like God had preordained for the work of Muhammad to be continued with a line of infallible successors known as imams, the first of which is Ali.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really important. I mean, as in terms of like the end of his life and his death, I mean, the key question between Sunnis and Shiis is Sunnis would hold that in various ways Muhammad sort of indicated that Abu Bakr, one of his friends and early companions, early converts, had a certain merit. So
Okay.
he did this by taking him with him and only Abu Bakr on his migration from Mecca to Medina. And then he did this by appointing Abu Bakr to pray in his place at the end of his life when Muhammad was sick.
Okay.
So, like, these are sort of hints or indications of the merit of Abu Bakr, which suggests that the early community's choice to make Abu Bakr the first successor or caliph was a good one. So that's really important. Shiites have a really profoundly different view of all of this. They say that Muhammad explicitly, he didn't simply suggest or hint at who had the particular merit to succeed him, but he explicitly appointed Ali to be a successor. So Ali, as I alluded to, I think earlier, is the son of Muhammad's paternal uncle named Abu Talib, so his cousin. Ali will also marry Muhammad's daughter, whose name is Fatima, so he's also his son-in-law. And the Shia will say that this was his explicit will. They actually commemorate that each year, the moment when Muhammad appointed Ali as his successor. And therefore, what Abu Bakr did with the cooperation of another fellow named Omar was sort of in direct contradiction to the will of Muhammad and necessarily the will of God. So this is like a very intense difference, point of debate between the two. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Muhammad's death, I mean, the story, at least what I know, I mean, first of all, there is a tradition of Muhammad being poisoned. I don't know, poisoned by one of the wives of the victims of Muhammad's campaigns against the Jews in Medina, that she poisoned a piece of meat that he ate from, and that it took a while for the poison to take its effect, but he eventually died. But the real key thing, as far as I know, in terms of difference, is that, I mean, Ali, according to most of the reports, he didn't sort of move to action right away to take power, but he was preparing Muhammad's body for burial
Okay.
after Muhammad's death. So he was doing the pious act, trusting that the community knew that he had explicitly been made Muhammad's successor. Whereas the Sunni narrative is Muhammad had never made that explicit. And so after Muhammad's death, there was a sort of meeting in a place in Medina where both the Medinans and the Meccans who went there, including Abu Bakr, who was a Meccan, came to this consensus that Abu Bakr should rule. So, and the consequences of that are just huge in the later subsequent division.
Okay. 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 And so and now, as far as the historical view of the critical historical view or historical critical view
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Muhammad's
yeah.
life, is is there a different sort of understanding of that, or um, yeah, would it?
Particularly of Muhammad's death,
Well, his
just the
like,
whole biography.
yeah, like his life, his
Yeah, yeah.
prophetic mission, and
Okay, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So absolutely. I mean, it's an extremely contentious field. I mean, one
Mhm,
thing that's important to say is, and as I'm sure you know, Shannon, I mean,
mhm,
it's extremely sensitive topic, the
yeah.
Prophet's life. And like when I teach my students here at Notre Dame about early Islam, Islam's emergence, I always take a moment at the beginning to say, like, listen, I have, some Muslim students, but mostly non-Muslim students. So I say, listen, it's really important for you to know just like the intensity of Muslim feeling and love for
Mhm,
Muhammad.
mhm,
So, I mean, for many Muslims, like it's just very difficult to hear non-Muslim scholars, or in some case, sort of ex-Muslim or atheist Muslim scholars, just like speculating in all these alternative things, or maybe even sort of questioning whether Muhammad's life actually has a high ethical standard.
mhm.
Like it's just very hard. So anyway, it's just important to point that out, and that
Yes.
complicates the whole field. And sometimes, like in a weird way, people are actually concerned ultimately about defending or maybe attacking the prophet, and that plays out through sort of sober academic criticism, book reviews, things like. Does that make sense? Like
Yes, it does. Yes,
kind of
yes.
plays out on a different level, but if you
Yeah.
scratch the surface, you see what's really going on is this like larger I don't know, questioning that has to do with Muslim love for Muhammad and
Hmm.
the sometimes the absence of love for Muhammad among non-Muslims. So
Hmm.
that's all at stake. And as I mentioned briefly before, some critical scholars have said Muhammad didn't exist.
Hmm.
I would say, like, and this comes to a surprise to a lot of Muslims, but the tradition of Western scholarship on Muhammad, up to, I don't know, the last few decades is actually pretty generous towards Muhammad.
Right.
Now, by scholarship, I mean like historical critical scholarship, because there is the legacy of medieval, like, anti-Islamic polemics
Hmm.
that, attack Muhammad in all sorts of ways.
Hmm.
But once scholars in the 19th century start writing in, different European languages about Muhammad, most of those scholars actually, they're either Jews
Hmm.
or sort of Christians who, for different reasons, see Muhammad as a really attractive figure. I could
Hmm.
explain that if it's interesting, but so they kind of want to use Muhammad to make a point about problems they see in Christianity, or they're kind of, atheist, humanist, deist, kind of one of those options,
Right.
folks. And so, like, the standard scholarship on Muhammad is actually tends above all, and some folks like John Tolan have written good books about this, tends above all to, like, see Muhammad as like a wise man, maybe
Hmm.
even a hero, a heroic figure,
Hmm.
who had great personal qualities. And what they do, however, is they set aside all the supernatural stuff. So
Okay.
all the reports of his miracles, riding on a horse with wings from Mecca to Jerusalem at night, set all
Hmm.
that aside, all the other miracles. And they're willing to point out some character flaws, but overall, like, they paint this positive portrait. And then what happens in the last few decades is, on the one hand, you have revisionism. So you have scholars who are like, well, actually, we can't be so confident in the traditional narrative. And even those who don't deny the historical existence of Muhammad, they would still say that you can't actually simply remove the supernatural and trust whatever remains.
Hmm.
They would
Okay.
say, no, even like the standard non-miraculous, non-supernatural reports about Muhammad have to
Hmm.
be examined very carefully. And
Hmm.
especially in the Meccan period of his life, we may know very, very little. So there's
Hmm.
that whole skepticism enters into the scene. And then you also have, just like the debate, which is more on the popular level, between, Muslims doing dawah, sort of evangelizing for the sake of Islam,
Hmm.
saying, Muhammad is actually great. He never had any of, a military, never conducted any military aggression. All of his
Hmm.
wars were defensive. All of his marriages were for good reason.
Hmm.
Uh, and then, some people, sort of polemical folks on the other side, responding, actually, no,
Hmm.
and emphasizing, maybe overemphasizing some of the ethical problems of Muhammad.
Right. Yeah. I remember reading a book by this was a long time ago by Tariq Ramadan
Okay, okay, yeah,
when he was sort of prominent in the early 2000s, and he
yep,
wrote a book on the life of
yeah,
Muhammad. And
yeah,
you do see that sort of it's very elevated, high praise.
yeah.
There's nothing that sort of to be critiqued
Yeah,
about the life of
and
Muhammad.
Shannon, that, like, some of the stuff that Tariq Ramadan and other scholars have written in that line, it's a new sort of thing, right? Because if you read the medieval biographies on most things,
Mhm.
there's no question of, like, coming up with arguments to justify
Mhm.
either the military campaigns or the various marriages or concubinage of
Mhm.
Muhammad. Like, this is, God has ordained the battles, God has
Mhm.
given him the right to have wives and concubines, and
Mhm.
they just speak about it. And then you get to the modern period, and these are obviously problematic questions if Muhammad is, like, the best man for all ages. And so
Mhm.
it's really something new. And it's interesting to see how this develops, this new language, in this regard. So, like, usually, in the Western context, Muslims will deny that Muhammad ever had any concubines. He only had wives, and he married them out of compassion, either
Mhm.
because they were widowers or for some sort of diplomatic thing, or So yeah, it's very interesting.
Right, right, right. Okay, okay. So next, I want to maybe shift to the to the Quran, if we can, and talk about outside of the traditional model. Uh, what can be said for the abundance of material that relates to that has some relation to Christianity in some way? You know,
Mhm.
there's for one, there's the words, uh, that are that have their origins in other Semitic languages like
Exactly.
Syriac or Ge'ez, which the
Yep.
late antique Ethiopic language,
Yes.
and even Greek.
Yes.
And then there's a lot of the apocryphal texts. I think like about Mary being in the temple
Exactly. Yep.
with who was it, Zachariah or
Exactly.
something like that,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
And then
Yeah.
yeah, and then you have the sleepers of Ephesus, which is I believe a late antique
Mhm.
story,
Mhm.
and then Dul Carnain, uh,
Yes.
which I think is everyone's favorite. They want to know who Dul Carnain is. Is that Alexander the Great or Cyrus or or someone like that? So yeah, I mean, if you could just speak on maybe what what the his what the academic view on that would be, and why we see so much material um, that might have its origins
Yeah.
in Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Terrific. So, I mean, this is sort of my favorite topic.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you might have to cut me off, but I mean,
Okay.
it's just for folks who haven't studied Islam, don't know the Quran well, it just may come as a big surprise how biblical the Quran is.
Mhm,
And like maybe the first thing to be said about its biblical nature is this does not mean that the Quran is a Christian book or a Jewish book, right? It has
mhm,
its own theology, and
right.
it's reshaping this biblical material for its own purpose.
Mhm,
So like we're not talking about the Quran just like copying or I don't know, falsifying things in the Bible.
mhm,
It's this creative, thoughtful, strategic process by which it's engaging with all the sort of stuff you mentioned
mhm,
for its own purpose. And sometimes, in my opinion, it you can sort of walk back that process and see how it is intentionally reshaping, sometimes even flipping a story around
mhm,
in order to undermine usually a possible Christian interpretation. I mean, a very simple example of this is we have these stories from, you kind of alluded to Christian apocryphal gospels,
mhm,
so not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John,
mhm,
but these are stories that circulated probably in the second, third Christian century, and they're used above all to sort of I don't know, affirm Christians in their belief in Christ's divinity. So,
mhm,
one of these is the story that Christ made a bird from clay, breathed
mhm,
into it, and brought it to life.
mhm,
And I mean, in the infancy gospel of John, where we have this story, he does so on the Sabbath as well.
mhm,
So, it shows that his lordship over the Sabbath, but it also shows that as God created Adam from clay and breathed life into him and brought him to life, so this boy, he's a little boy when he does so in the Christian story, is able to do the same. So his divine nature just shows through. So, and the Quran repeats the story, but then, as you may know, it adds immediately afterwards by the permission of God.
mhm. Okay.
So, I mean, to me, that's very thoughtful. Like that's intentional.
Yeah.
When it reports miracles of Moses,
Mhm,
it does not add by the permission of God. It just
mhm.
has Moses turn a staff into a snake,
Okay.
but it
Yeah.
does it with Jesus.
Yeah.
So it's like okay, like I'm going to take this story from the Christian tradition, repeat it in my own way, and then
Mhm.
undermine the whole purpose of the story for Christians.
Right. Right.
Actually, I think a similar case to this is the stories of angels bowing down to Adam in the
Mhm.
Quran, which we
Okay.
don't have in the Bible either, but we
Mhm,
have in early Christian texts. But in the early Christian texts, the story of the angels bowing down to Adam, it it's a way of pointing to or alluding to the angelic worship of Christ.
Mm,
So both Philippians and I believe Hebrews
mm,
allude to the angels, bending their knee at the name of Christ.
mm,
And this story sort of, this is Adam before his fall. So when he's a perfect image of God, makes
mm,
him the first man, as Christ is the second man.
mm,
So the Quran tells the story as well, but then it reshapes the story. There's nothing Christological about the story in the Quran.
mm,
It becomes a story which simply explains why the devil has wants to seek vengeance against man. So he
mm.
uses the story in a fundamentally different way that doesn't point to the divinity of Christ.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe I should stop there for now and let you follow up with another question because
No,
the
yeah,
relationship is so robust. There's so
yeah,
much between the Bible and the Quran.
yeah. I guess so. What? How is it that we find the uh, words that might come up from other Semitic
From other
languages?
languages. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, like Ge'ez,
yep,
or Syriac.
yeah,
Uh, how is that sort
yeah.
of?
I mean, I don't have I don't have 100% confidence in reconstructing the full process.
Mhm,
Um, these words are often Arabized. So, like
mhm,
an interesting case of this is the word Injil
okay.
in the Quran, which is used for just staying in the world of the Quran. It's used for a revelation given by God to Jesus.
Mhm, okay.
The complicating thing is the word Injil, it certainly comes ultimately from the Greek word for gospel, which is
Mhm,
euangelion.
mhm,
But it's been Arabized, so it
right,
follows sort of a standard declension that you would have for a noun in
mhm,
Arabic as Injil, but it's clearly coming from the N, the G, and the L that you
mhm,
have in euangelion. You can see how that works. Yeah, and just as you said, there's definitely vocabulary coming from Ethiopic. A
mhm,
famous example of this, a sort of interesting one, is the word for the disciples or the apostles of Christ,
mhm.
which in the Quran is hawariyun.
Okay.
And this is sort of strange because if you're expecting Arabic, you would expect to see something like Sahaba or Ansar, different Arabic words.
Okay.
You would accept something like the word apostolos, maybe if
Mhm,
it was coming from Greek, but then you have this word hawariyun. And what
mhm,
makes it weirder is that that word in the Arabic language seems to come from a root that refers to the color white.
mm,
And so the Muslim commentators, they see this word hawariyun being used for Christ's disciples,
mhm,
and they're like, well, it must have something to do with white. And I don't
mhm,
mean to make light. I mean, they're just doing the best they can. They don't know other languages. They only know Arabic,
mhm,
the early commentators. So they start telling these stories. Well, maybe they wore white garments, so
mhm,
logical enough. Or
mhm,
another interpretation is maybe they worked as bleachers of cloth. So that
mhm.
was their job. Like instead of being fishermen, they were
Right.
bleachers of cloth, right? And that's why the Quran calls them the white ones or the white garbed ones or the white makers. I mean,
Mhm,
in fact, this is, it kind of vindicates historical critical scholarship because,
mhm,
in fact, it clearly comes from the Ethiopic word, which is hawarye, which is used in the Ethiopia. It literally means to walk, but it's the word used in the Ethiopic Bible, Gez, as you said,
mhm.
to refer to the apostles. So anyway, so we've got words coming from the so-called North, Greek,
Right.
lots of Syriac, words coming from the South or Southwest, from, across the Red Sea in Abyssinia, Ethiopia. And I mean, most likely Christianity is entering into the Arabian Peninsula from both directions,
Mhm,
because we
mhm.
know that Southern Arabian Christianity, which probably was principally Jacobite, but there might have been some, a so-called Nestorian presence there.
Okay.
That's definitely coming from Ethiopia. I
Mhm,
mean, your viewers may know this, but Ethiopia is this profoundly rich Christian culture with a rich literature,
yes.
its own distinct liturgical, its own distinct canon of the Bible, but its own distinct liturgical practices, and it's also a great political force, so it's spreading
Yeah.
into Southern Arabia. And
Yeah.
then Christianity, mostly through monks, is coming from the north as well. So it would
Mhm.
make sense that Mecca, sort of in the middle, you would get both kinds of words.
Right. Right. Okay. 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 Um, so now, I've heard scholars, and this is in particular Dr. Guillaume D, who did a lecture. I don't remember how long ago, but he talked about, you know, uh, he talked about, you know, um, evil spirits and the what are they called?
The
The
jinn,
jinn.
or
The
yeah,
jinn. Sorry. Yeah.
yeah.
But the one of his remarks in regarding a question, was that he believed that there should be sort of a he argues for sort of a separation between the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's preaching. And
Mhm.
so I wonder if that has some
Yeah,
credence
some
to it.
merit. I can't
Yeah.
reconstruct how he was thinking through the problem in relation to jinn. It
Hmm.
could be that he saw the jinn, having their own distinct story that is not connected to other material in the Quran. But in any case, Guillaume D is very, very careful scholar, and he's noticed that you have certain literary features in the text. So, for example, you have repeated material in the text, and you have multiple versions of so repeated material on like sort of a micro level, so something we call doublets, like an individual verses or part of a verse that's repeated. And then you have repetition at a sort of macro level where you have whole narratives, like the story I referred to earlier about the
Right.
angels bowing to Adam appears 7 different times in 7 different chapters of the Quran. And so, it does seem, and then you have the larger problem of, um, uh, is the Quran nothing but sort of a frozen transcript of what Muhammad said? It's so stylistic that, your viewers may know the Quran, almost all of it rhymes,
Mhm.
and parts of it have like this artistic sort of flourish to it, where the rhyme is also sort of rhythmic, and you could see maybe the author like really trying to make the text beautiful. And then other parts, if you look at a chapter like 33, Ahzab, are like long verses, seem to be working out some like legal questions, and the artistic quality doesn't seem to be the same. It seems to be almost like juridical. So, eh, so like the traditional model that the companions memorized exactly what Muhammad said, exactly when he said it, and never changed one iota, use that expression.
Right.
I
Right.
mean,
Right.
this to critical scholars seems a little bit hard to believe.
Mhm.
It seems more likely that, so Muhammad said something in, I don't know, 616 in Mecca in the spring one
Mhm.
day, and he said it, and then he said it another time, he said it another time. And what we know from the formation of the Gospels is that, of something called form criticism,
Mhm.
is that what tends to happen in these situations is you have an early stage of oral transmission where
Mhm.
there's like intense sort of fluidity, dynamism in the way these traditions may be told on multiple occasions, but then
Mhm.
repeated by the community, maybe reworked to improve them or to like negotiate possible conflicts or contradictions between two different things. And
Mhm.
then you sort of get to another stage where they're being written down. This is connected to like community formation, because the communities begins to form an identity. So
Mhm.
things get written down, and then you have a third stage where you have like actual conscious concern for the formation of a scripture. So that would
Mhm.
kind of be a third stage.
Yeah.
where and there's different concerns come in, like liturgical concerns. Is this going to be a text to be recited? So what Guillaume D is basically getting at is, I mean, he speaks about protectionism in Quranic studies. He's like, the way most people think about the formation of Quranic text is just naive. I don't think he uses that term. I don't want to put something in his mouth that he wouldn't think. But
Okay.
that's kind of like the vibe, right? Like it's just
Right.
naive. Like we know that when scriptures and communities form, that there are all these stages, there's all this dynamism, back and forth, improvement of the text,
Mhm.
scribal reworkings of the text. Let's be sophisticated and realistic. Let's use the insights
Mhm.
of, first of all, what we know of how texts are formed, oral and written transmission, but also the insights of sort of more sociological dimension of how communities form and how
Mhm.
that process is related to formation of a scripture.
Right.
I find that a very impressive sort of model for thinking of the Quran's formation.
Right.
Obviously, it takes you away from the traditional model. And so
Yeah.
some people would say, oh, this is Orientalism,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
it's part of a larger project to sort of undermine the Islamic world, or maybe in some colonial way,
Mhm.
to like dominate, to, West East domination. So
Mhm.
then some of that polemic gets in there. So it's all super complicated.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. It sounds, yeah, it sounds like that. But it to me, I find it very interesting, to like listen to all these different, scholars, and I think her name was Angelica Newworth, or
No, exactly. Yep.
yeah, she has a different concept of it, and then
Yeah, she's a
you know,
little closer to the tradition. I mean,
yeah,
still very, great, great scholar, one of the leaders of the field for the past, I don't know, many decades.
right,
Yeah. So, but she's a little closer to tradition. Yeah.
right, right. Okay, okay. Now, as far as you had alluded to this, the Meccan and Medinan surahs, right? Is it, is it in your opinion? Do you think it's correct to sort of separate the surahs in, like, the surahs in that way? That there's Meccan surahs and then there's Medinan surahs.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of a debate this is among scholars,
It's a
but
huge debate.
okay.
So actually, interestingly, Shannon, it's a debate among believing Muslim scholars,
Mhm.
and then it's a debate among critical scholars. And among believing Muslim scholars, there's sort of there are different things at stake. So there, the debate is, um, does it in some way lessen the uh, the recognition of God's providential plan for communicating His message to the world if you become too lost in the historical process? If
Okay.
that kind of makes sense. I didn't say that very well, but like some scholars, most famously in the West at least, Fazlur Rahman was a scholar at Chicago.
Okay.
He wrote a book called Major Themes of the Quran, and he's basically like, we have to stop doing things chronologically,
Right.
thinking like, oh, there's a development on this theme between Mecca into Medina in the Quran. So if we want to understand it, we have to see how it works sort of in time, right? Whatever theme, on women, on violence,
Mhm.
on fasting, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
And he was like, no, like God is providential care. And so he had a vision for the canonical text of the Quran in its final form.
Mhm.
And that's what we as Muslims have to look at, right?
Okay.
But actually, the medieval Islamic world, there is a concern for, and it's Muslims who come up with the idea of listing the order of the surahs chronologically.
Right.
So, like all these medieval handbooks, they speak of the Meccan surahs, and they'll actually give them in an order, the Medinan ones. And that's really important because, I mean, it helps them tell the story of Muhammad's life,
Mhm.
but it also has a role for legal questions because something that comes later can abrogate or replace something that comes earlier.
Mhm. Okay. And
Among, yeah,
yeah, when you say abrogate, you mean it can something that was revealed earlier can be sort of
yep,
replaced, or
exactly.
or something else can be put on top of it, almost like an amendment or something, right?
Yeah, something like an amendment. Yeah, there are actually different types of abrogation.
Mm,
So one is a verse will come and replace an earlier verse or earlier
mm,
passage, both in the text of the Quran and in its legal force or like norm setting force.
mm,
So then you wouldn't see the old verse, right? Because God would have communicated through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad that the old verse should no longer be recited as divine word. So
mm.
that's one possible one. But the
Okay.
more common one is, I'm just sort of thinking, along with Muslims and how they would explain this. The more common one is, no, another verse comes to replace or amend
Mm,
the legal implications of an earlier verse, but that
mm,
earlier verse is still God's word in scripture and meant to be recited. So it's like liturgical value remains, but its
mm.
legal value is either reduced or replaced. So
Okay.
that's the more common kind of abrogation. Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of like, and I remember one of the scholars you had on your podcast said something like this, like, uh, when you recite it, it's all about if it can be recited during the liturgy is what's
Exactly.
most important versus
Exactly.
its hermeneutics or
Yep.
something like that, right?
Yeah. That's how I
Okay.
put it as well. Yep.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um, so going to the direction of prayer, the Qibla, right? Uh, as I understand it, Muslims uh, used to pray in the direction of Jerusalem, right? That this was like Jerusalem had a major importance, and then there was a turn away from Jerusalem towards direction of prayer towards Mecca. Can you? Is there an explanation for that? A traditional explanation
Yeah.
and a historical academic explanation for
Yeah.
that?
Great question.
Okay.
And like in broad outlines,
Mhm.
uh, this is part of tradition.
Okay.
So, yeah, from a critical point of view, it's very hard to verify
Mhm.
that there was a period when Muslims prayed towards Jerusalem.
Mhm.
Actually, even the tradition is a little more complicated because there are different opinions about when the Muslims were in Mecca,
Mhm.
which direction they prayed.
Mhm.
It, because the period of time when they prayed to Jerusalem is like the first period of time when they arrive in Medina,
Okay.
um, until God reveals in the second chapter of the Quran a verse um, which I could only paraphrase in really rough terms, but God says to Muhammad something like, we see you looking up, looking for a better qibla. We have appointed for you the direction of prayer, the sacred house, or something like that.
Mhm.
And that's explained then in the commentaries of, well, up to this point in Medina, Muslims were praying along with the Jews to
Mhm.
Jerusalem, and then God sort of turned them around
Mhm.
to pray towards Mecca.
Okay.
So yeah, and a lot is made about this, especially in the current political context,
Mhm.
because therefore Muslims will speak of Jerusalem as the city of the first Qibla or
Mhm.
direction of prayer. So
Mhm.
that gives it extra value for Muslims as a holy Islamic city.
Mhm.
So it has, there's political implications that, are pretty obvious, at least when we're recording this, it's the middle of the Gaza war.
Yes.
Um, yeah, and I mean the other thing is that I mean this is a well set Islamic tradition. There's even a mosque in Medina that's built that supposedly traditionally is at the site where Muhammad was praying towards Jerusalem with his followers, received this verse from the angel Gabriel and told them to turn around. So it's
Mhm.
known as Masjid al-Qiblatain, the mosque of the two Qiblas. So the one
Okay.
to Jerusalem, the one to Mecca.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's really hard to know. As far as I know, we do not have, any mosque which has what's known as a mihrab. So
Mhm.
that's the little niche that points the direction of
Mhm.
the Qibla facing Jerusalem.
Okay.
We do have some, there's controversy around this question too. There are some early mosques that don't face directly Mecca either.
Mm,
But I believe they don't actually face towards Jerusalem. They face further to the north, but not that far north. Maybe
mm,
someone in the comments will correct me on that. But even if they were, I mean, that would be strange because in principle, the change of the direction of prayer happens very early in Medina.
mm,
So these mosques, they date to the post-Muhammadan era.
mm,
So yeah, I mean, the direction of prayer is super important for Muslims because it unifies them.
mm,
For Western scholars, the move towards Mecca, for from Western scholars who don't see this in a traditional way, they would say this was very thoughtful. It was like Muhammad came up with this idea that he needed to orient the whole religion around Abraham, Ishmael, and Mecca, developed what they would see as the myth of Abraham and Ishmael traveling to Mecca,
mm,
connecting that to the Kaaba. So this is like, for in the old Western way of telling the story of Muhammad's life, this is like a key, like hinge moment where suddenly there's no question of sort of working with the Jews or integrating Judaism into his movement. Now he
mm,
breaks from the Jews and orients himself towards Mecca.
Okay. Okay. Now with that, uh, I just want to add this in because this is something I thought was really fascinating, and I believe Stephen Shoemaker did some work on this or something like
Mhm,
that. But
mhm.
the Church of Cathesma,
Yes,
uh, which was I guess a sort of a was a pilgrimage site or a church that Christians would go to, uh, to uh, celebrate some sort of uh, something in the liturgical year, right? But that the framework of the church, architecturally, is very similar to the. It's not a mosque, so it's I guess
right, right.
it's a
The Dome of the Rock, or
the Dome of the Rock, right?
yeah, yeah,
That they have great similarities to each other as far as their outlook. Um, is that can we say something about that or
yeah. Yes, this is really like this is one of those sort of pivotal moments in recent scholarship on Islam's emergence, where you actually have like concrete evidence, like you can actually point to something that gives you new data by which to think through Islam's emergence. And that's the work of Stephen Shoemaker. Actually, Guillaume D has also written about this, but Shoemaker was sort of the one initially to see the importance of this church. So, I mean, in brief, the Kathisma Church is in ruins, but it's an octagonal church. So it's an octagon. It's on the road that goes Jerusalem south to Bethlehem. And like that's super important because in the early centuries of Christianity, this was a church that commemorated a place where Mary rested, either when she was heading to Bethlehem with Joseph, or when she and Joseph and the infant Jesus were fleeing Bethlehem on their way to Egypt. Um, there are some traditions which, and Shoemaker and Dee have written about this with more precision, but there's some traditions which make it an alternate site of Christ's birth,
okay.
which is pretty important. So, and that's actually connected to a tradition that you referred to, I think alluded to earlier, Shannon, because the early text which connects Mary with the temple, that text also has the birth of Jesus. I'm pretty sure it's called the Proto Gospel of James. That has the birth of Jesus sort of in the wilderness outside of Bethlehem and not in the city itself.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so I mean, but a really intriguing feature of this church is that it's an octagon and its dimensions are precisely like that of, I shouldn't say precisely, it might be off a little bit. So its dimensions
Oh,
are like that of the Dome of the Rock, which is also an octagon.
right.
And so, I mean, it seems pretty likely that the Dome of the Rock was modeled on the Kathisma Church. If you go to Jerusalem today, it's hard really to see because I mean the Kathisma Church has been completely destroyed, so you just see the foundation. You know, you
Yeah.
can see the octagon, and then you see sort of the glorious Dome of the Rock. So you're like, how do these match? But
Yeah. Yeah.
I believe the Israeli archaeologist is named Rina Avner, who has, you know, did the actual, oh, whatever you call it, archaeological study,
Yeah. Yeah.
surface something, I forget what it's called. And
Yeah.
she sort of detailed all the dimensions and things, and it's really precise. So then you sort of ask the question, well, why would the early Muslims, Dome of the Rock is really early, it's built around 690 by
Okay.
Abd al-Malik. So, you know, why would these early Muslims build something that looked just like the Kathisma Church? Um, and it's probably because the Kathisma Church in its own right was a pilgrimage site,
Mhm.
probably not just because it was seen as a resting place of Mary, but
Mhm.
probably because of those traditions that it was the site of Jesus's nativity. And so, you know, the early Muslims want to sort of co-opt that. Eventually, they actually put in a prayer niche, a mihrab, into the Kathisma Church, and
Mhm.
it becomes a mosque eventually, the Kathisma Church.
Mhm.
Anyway, so the heart of the matter and the really important point is that the Kathisma Church is also associated in writings that we know about this from writings that speak of the prayers that would take place at the Kathisma Church, that it was remembered as the spot of a miracle where the infant Jesus called down a palm tree to
Mhm.
lower its branches to give its fruit, the dates, to
Mhm.
the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Mhm.
And so we have a co-location between the spot of the birth of Christ with a miracle of a palm tree and dates. And this
Mhm.
is actually exactly what we find in the Quran, had been a big riddle. No one understood why the Quran associates the miracle of the date palm with Jesus's birth,
Mhm.
whereas in earlier or in Christian texts until this point, we
Mhm.
had only found it in conjunction with the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt. I don't know if this is all making sense. I feel like
Yes. No.
I'm
Yeah. It
I'm being
is.
as coherent as I could, but
Yeah.
here we have a church which brings together the palm tree miracle and the
Mhm.
birth of Jesus uniquely. Now, that's
Oh,
for a shoemaker, that's a big point. It's like uniquely here. And then,
right.
of course, he's going to go to the next step. And this
Mhm.
is where it becomes sort of controversial for Islamic origins. He would say,
Mhm.
wait, why is the Quran reflecting this Palestinian tradition?
Mhm.
I thought Islam began in Mecca, way down in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. And so
Mhm.
it's another argument for him that at least some traditions in the Quran began further north towards Palestine.
Mm. Okay. 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 Well, we'll stop there, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I want to thank you for joining me, and hopefully we can do a part two, you know, and with all my questions and thoughts flowing all over the place,
Sure,
you know.
sure.
So
I'd be
yeah.
really happy to. I'd be really happy to. Thank you. Yeah, sorry if I rambled a bit, but yeah, really, really
Oh,
happy
no.
to be on your podcast. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. All right, Dr. Reynolds. Until next time.
Thank you.